Okay, we'll start in 3, 2, 1. Welcome, everybody. My name is Lorne Epstein. I am the host of the Lorne Epstein Show. And on today's show, I have as my special guest Dr. Gary Shiffman. Gary's a friend and a neighbor. He's also one of the world's preeminent behavioral scientists working in the field of national security. His impactful innovations empower people and governments to make communities freer and safer in a very complex world. Gary's a decorated U.S. Navy Gulf War veteran. He is the CEO and founder of Giant Oak, which provides threat detection technology to national security and financial institutions. Gary also teaches security studies at Georgetown University, and he served as a senior policy advisor to U.S. Senate leadership, among his many other positions. Today, we're going to hear from Gary about his new book entitled The Economics of Violence, which was published by Cambridge University Press. Gary, welcome to the show. How are you and your family doing?
Great, thanks, Lauren. Thanks for hosting me and putting me on your show. I'm very excited to have a chat with you. The family's doing great. We're all at home and getting along fine. We're using lots of bandwidth, I think, with everybody taking classes and working remotely. But so far, so good. Thanks for asking.
Wonderful. So I took a look at your book, and I was actually kind of excited because it's kind of a shift in way people may perceive how to approach violence. And I was wondering if you could kind of give your overarching theme of the book. What's the main message, the takeaway that you wanted folks to have?
Great, Lauren, thanks. So the main message of the book is to think about human behavior and fundamental human nature and look for the cause or the origin of violence in fundamental nature of the human condition. And then if you do that, we've got this science which will allow us to take a scientific approach to understanding violence and coercion and corruption. The alternative to that, if that sounds obvious to you, well, we don't do that today. I've spent my career in the national security field, and we tend to label violence as a way to simplify and understand, but I think we mislead. We don't actually understand. What do I mean by that? We talk about violence in terms of crime and insurgency and terrorism, for example. So if somebody's a terrorist, somebody else is an insurgent, and somebody else is a criminal, and we treat them as if they're distinct phenomena. The institutions of the U.S. government, for example, are built to address those distinct phenomena as if they were distinct. My argument is they're not distinct. They're all manifestations of the human condition. And if we take a step back and understand fundamental human nature the way a behavioral scientist would, which is what I am, I think we can get much more clarity in understanding violence in the world as we observe it, and hopefully do a better job of combating violence, coercion, corruption when we see it.
That's really interesting. Could you quantify like the kind of either the cost or the consequences of violence in our world, and not just the global violence, but violence in our neighborhoods, violence in the workplace? Is there some way to say, well, here's this problem, but how would we measure it?
Yeah, it'd be great if we could measure it in broad ways, but I think the way to do measurement is in the specific case. So the example that first comes to mind for me is the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Again, I come from a national security world and background, and to the extent that we didn't do well in those wars, I'm part of the problem as well, which is why I'm writing this book. But we clearly didn't do well. We've been at war for 17 or so years now and haven't really performed well, even though we have the best, most advanced military in the world. But you know what? Sometimes that's not how you win. And in fact, the understanding of the definition of winning is part of the problem. So, I mean, you could quantify all of the costs that we, the United States, that humanity has incurred in 17 years of wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. You could look at the war on drugs, so-called, the cartels in Mexico and Colombia and Central America, smuggling drugs into the United States. You could look at the global arms trade. You could look at the global trade in rhino horn and elephant ivory. You could look at the global trade in human trafficking, selling people. Believe it or not, in 2020, it's still big business to sell people in the world. All of these things still happen, Lorne. They still go on in spite of our best efforts and the best and brightest thinking about and combating these phenomena for years and years and years. And so quantify it. I mean, I don't know how to even start quantifying it, but violence and coercion could happen everywhere. And what I'm proposing is, if we think about it as an expression of human nature and human behavior, and think about people as actors in competitive environments, worried about survival and self-interest, then what happens is, and this is the key point, the line between an insurgent and a terrorist and a criminal blur. Those lines blur. And when the lines blur, that's a good thing. That means we can take a step back and maybe understand where the violence really came from. We get it so wrong today. And I'm hoping that this book makes at least a modest contribution in helping people who are dedicated to serving on the front lines and making us safer, whether that's an analyst or somebody in law enforcement, somebody in the military, somebody in a bank, working on compliance or financial crimes, or somebody working anti-corruption issues. I think everybody who's in those fields and working those issues, as I have for my whole career, hopefully they will benefit from this book and this thesis.
I love how you titled it Economics of Violence. It sounds like, kind of taking what you said a little further, is that if we look at all violence and boil it down, we can see that there's a commonality amongst the motivations, and frame it in economic terms. Like, I know you use the word competitor and entrepreneurs, and I'm like, well, that's something that people can kind of embrace and grapple onto a little bit better. Is that accurate?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. Instead of using the labels, which I said are convenient but misleading, I would suggest different labels. I would suggest you talk about firms and entrepreneurs and markets. And if you talk in terms of firms, entrepreneurs, and markets, the world actually makes a lot of sense.
Well, let's talk about some specific cases in a second. To me, the big question is that you started, I mean, you were a Navy officer, and I'm guessing somewhere along the lines, you've changed your perspective on what violence is. Because the violence, the message you're saying is opposite of what I, as a U.S. citizen, have heard from my government for decades.
Right. I absolutely, my views have evolved into this. And again, I'm somebody who woken up every morning for over the past 2 decades and thought about public safety and public security. And this is really my vocation, is how do I make the world more difficult for people to do bad things, or how do I help other people, empower other people to make the world more difficult for people to do bad things? I started my career, Lorne, as you said, in my first job out of college was I was commissioned in the U.S. Navy as a ensign, and I get out to my first ship, and about a year later, I get deployed to the Gulf War. So really, my first job out of college is the Gulf War. And
the first Gulf War. The
first Gulf War. Yes, I'm that old, and so are you. The first Gulf War in 1990-91. So I was there, like I said, first job out of college, and I started to get the professional training of a warfighter in the U.S. military. And I come back and I work in the Pentagon, and and I had actually been trained on how to fight and defeat the Soviet Navy at sea. So this was my professional military education, was large, large warfare in blue water, right, in the deep water, in the blue water, against this very powerful Soviet Navy. And then I leave active duty, and I'm National Security Advisor in the US Senate. And I start to see and focus on acts of terrorism in Israel. So the Intifada and suicide terrorism. And it was the Ben Yehuda and the Mahana Yehuda bombings in 1997 that really caught my attention, because, Lauren, I realized I had absolutely no idea what to do. I was a national security advisor in the US Senate. I was in a position of authority and power, and I was clueless because I knew how to defeat the Soviet Navy at sea. And by 1997, that was actually not a valuable skill to have. And the challenge that I was trying to think about was, how do you prevent a suicide terrorist from putting on a backpack full of explosives, walking into a crowded market, detonating it, killing themselves and 100 people around them? How do you do that? That in the world in which I was trained to be a national security professional, you find the people in the other uniforms and you shoot at them. That's totally irrelevant. And you shoot at them from a distance. That's totally irrelevant in a world in which civilians put on explosives surrounded by other civilians and detonate a bomb. There is no other. There is, this is what we call war among the people. So you have combatants in and among the population. You don't know who the enemy is. You don't know who wants to kill you, and who the threat is. And this was the beginning of the evolution of my thinking. I went on and got a PhD in economics, but I did that because economics to me is a science of human behavior. And I applied it to the behavior of people who walk into markets and detonate a bomb, killing themselves and others around them. Economics starts from this premise that individuals are sane and rational. And if you remember way back to your undergrad introduction to economics days, you probably got that definition somewhere along the way. Economics is the science of individuals making decisions in conditions of scarcity, and that we assume people are sane and rational. And that is when somebody is a suicide terrorist.
Gary, I'm gonna have you pause just for a second.
Yeah.
Your camera's bouncing a little bit.
Okay.
Just letting you know. But
yeah.
Getting back to
Thank you. Good to know. Getting used to the economics. Getting used to the new normal. Thank you.
I know. This is
new skills every day. Right. If you cannot relax the assumption of sane and rational, then you have to be able to craft a theory of suicide terrorism in which that suicide terrorist is not drunk, not brainwashed, and not insane, that they are calm, cool, and collected when they walk into that crowded market and detonate that bomb, killing themselves. So how do you do that? That, to me, was the beginning of my journey into behavioral science applied to organized violence or non-random violence.
And so what had you think that, like, I think that the rhetoric that I hear is that them over there, they're crazy. There's never really a definition of their motivation other than there's something wrong with them and they don't like what we're doing.
Yeah, that's just wrong. I mean, that's just so wrong. That's why we've been at war for 17 years and haven't done well, haven't figured this out. Violence, as I said just a moment ago, violence comes from this place where scarcity and survival meet. Or
yeah,
expected scarcity.
I want to talk about scarcity because in my very thin study of philosophy, there are some universal truths that human beings are like baked in with scarcity, like not enough
Yeah,
time, not enough love, not enough money, not enough
yeah,
friends.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
And so you're saying everyone experiences this, and this is a manifestation.
Yeah, I think, if you go back to the phrase I used at the start, the human condition, this is something that's fascinated me for years. And Lorne, I know you pretty well to know that you've also been thinking about the human condition for quite a while. And there are a lot of ways in which you can describe and explain the human condition, but one is to focus on this idea of scarcity, or expected scarcity, because we all are forward looking and take actions based upon expectations. We're not always right, but we always take actions based upon expectations. So scarcity or the expectation of scarcity drives human behavior. And when that scarcity, as I said before, bumps up against survival or expected survival, now you're going to see coercion, you're going to see corruption, you're going to see violence.
So now let's get, I mean, that's kind of macro. Let's get into the
Yeah.
micro. I know in the book, which I haven't read, but you gave me a nice summary. In the book, you talk about some specific people. So, for example, Osama bin Laden.
Yeah.
And I thought, well, I'd love to hear that, your take on his interpretation of real or perceived scarcity. And as an economic actor, right? If we say, so I don't think you've heard it here, folks, those who are listening, but Osama bin Laden did this for economic reasons, or other reasons, and let's talk about that a bit, because
Yeah.
it's relevant.
First
People
of
can
all,
grab that.
First of all, definitionally, of course, he did it for economic reasons, and everything that you do is for economic reasons, and everything that I do is for economic reasons. But I didn't use the word money. It's really interesting when you talked before about how we're conditioned to hear certain stories and narratives and ideas and themes. Well, one of the narratives that you're conditioned to hear is when I say the word economic, you hear money. I'm not talking about money. Economics is the science of individuals making decisions in conditions of scarcity. That's economics. Economics is not how to make money. Economics is making decisions in conditions of scarcity. And how do we build a science of human decision making given that we face scarcity? That's economics. So everything that you do and I do and Osama bin Laden did can be put into economic terms because it's decision making in conditions of scarcity. Does that make sense?
Totally. I mean, yeah,
Okay.
that's great. I love it.
So
Yeah,
so
go on.
back to your question. So is Osama bin Laden an economic actor? Absolutely. You have to ask yourself this. Let me go to the opposite extreme. Could we say that Osama bin Laden was on drugs, was brainwashed, or did he behave in a way that was consistent over time, was non-random, was, in retrospect, when you look at the things he did, they make sense. His actions make sense. And the answer is obviously they do. It's a story of somebody who was optimizing something and took actions consistently over many years, consistent with that optimization. That's economics. It's understanding that pattern of human behavior and finding the narrative or the storyline in which that makes sense. And Osama bin Laden behaved in a very sane and rational way. Now, he might have behaved in an immoral way, but that's irrelevant. I'm not talking about morality today. I'm talking about logic. I'm talking about, is there a goal? Is there a purpose? And are the acts that that the choices people are making and the actions they're taking consistent with that goal? And the answer is absolutely.
So was there a way, given your framework, to understand what Osama bin Laden's, what was he optimizing for? What was his logical framework?
Yeah. So the first thing I would say is I don't know what he was thinking. And I don't think anybody else knows what he was thinking. There are some really good books by some really smart people who have focused on Osama bin Laden for years, and they have theories about what he might have been thinking. And I'll talk about some of those right now, but I just want to put a big asterisk next to that is we don't know. We don't know what anybody's really thinking, but we can look at the pattern of behavior and we can infer what some of those goals or motivations might be. Okay, so
So
I just want to.
that's really good. I like that. So if we look at myself, right,
Yeah,
all the actions I'm doing, we might look at what are the results that I've been producing,
yeah,
and then saying, okay, all the decisions I've been taking have been to generate those results.
yeah, right. Right. That it's this idea of non-randomness, right? Lauren, your behavior is very not random. What you did today, what you do tomorrow, and what you
You haven't talked to
do
my wife recently.
a week, no, you're still not random. Like I said, she could disagree with you. We do wrong things all the time, but it doesn't mean that with the time we made a decision, we thought it was the right decision. That's different, right? But in your own mind, there's a plot and there's a narrative that you're following, and when you stick to that narrative, it causes your actions to be non-random or purposeful. It's another way of saying the non-randomness. It's purposeful. Your behavior is purposeful, and so is mine, and so is Osama bin Laden's. Whether you like the purpose or not, I don't care. It's purposeful, and so therefore you can draw inferences from it.
So let's talk about Osama bin Laden specifically, because I know you have some thoughts on that.
So the theory from the experts who followed him is that that he was ambitious, but his hierarchy within the family, there was always going to be a limit to his ability to rise up and achieve levels of greatness, and the opportunity to support the fighters in Afghanistan gave him an opportunity to gain power, to gain notoriety, and so he went and pursued that. So he chose a career path. Again, I'm not using terms with good, bad, right, or wrong associated with them, right? He's an economic actor, and he found a career path outside of the family business that gave him a chance to break away and make a name for himself. And it had to do with supporting freedom fighters, if you will, in Afghanistan, who were opposing the outsiders coming into that country. He found common cause with some Egyptians that also wanted to overthrow their government and get the outsiders out. So it got wrapped up in this narrative and this storyline of countering the takfiris, the non-true Muslims. So it was this Muslim versus Muslim battle against we're the true believers and you're not the true believers. And then the innovation that Osama bin Laden brought was to go after what's called the far enemy. So in this line of research, there's the near enemy and the far enemy. The near enemy are the Muslims who aren't true Muslims, which had been the nature of conflict up to this point. And then Osama bin Laden shows up, who's from a very wealthy family, has some money. And he says, you know what, we'll go after the near enemy later. Let's go after the far enemy, because, you've got the Westerners, the Russians, the Americans, they're in our lands, and let's go after them first. And so he generated a movement to go after the far enemy, so-called, and he generated a lot of support for that. A, because he had a narrative. B, he had money, and C, he allied with some people in the early stages that gave momentum to his initiative. So he was able to get across what in economics we call a survival threshold or a barrier to entry, right? So he created, and I'm going to bring it right back to where we were about 20 minutes ago. He's an entrepreneur. He created a firm. He created a firm by hiring talent and people, and he actually brought some other firms in together. So think about like mergers and acquisition. He took a couple of firms, brought them together. He generated some initial funding, some seed funding came from his own personal wealth. And then he started to raise additional outside money for it. So now he had a viable enterprise. So he was now running a firm in a competitive market. He did really well for a while because the market, he was able to command a significant market presence for a while. And then the 9/11 attacks happened, and then the United States entered that market with the intent of finding and killing him. That happened, and so that, you know, he's out of business now as an entrepreneur. But what happened is what used to be Al-Qaeda in Iraq was defeated. Air quotes for people who can't see me, was defeated. Al-Qaeda in Iraq was defeated. But the marketplace in which Osama bin Laden built and operated this firm didn't change. We didn't change the fundamental structure of the market or the incentives of that market. And so along comes al-Baghdadi, and he's the leader of ISIS, or the Islamic State. The Islamic State is the successor organization to Al-Qaeda in Iraq. So the firm remained in existence, even though we killed the leader or the entrepreneur or the CEO, right?
So I want to talk more about, you talked about a couple of things. You mentioned marketplace and innovation.
Yeah.
And I want to get to those things. But I want our listeners to know, there's some folks out there, if you want to ask Gary a question while we're doing this, just raise your hand, and there'll be a couple of points where we will be taking some questions. So just raise your hand, and we'll get to you. Or you can even put it in the chat, and I'll call on you. So we'll do that in a minute. We're going to take a quick 5-second break here for station identification. So Gary, what's interesting to me is the whole notion of the marketplace, because it seems like there's been this marketplace for global terror, the boogeyman, the American boogeyman. I mean, when we were kids, like you said, it was the Soviets. Then all of a sudden it wasn't, and then it was Osama bin Laden. And is when you say the marketplace, is that the construct, the framework that we're talking about? Is there only one kind of marketplace that can only be occupied by so many actors?
No, it's a great question, but again, it's a deep question. You keep going to the deep topics, Lorne, which does not surprise me at all. We're surrounded by markets. We're constantly operating in different markets. In our neighborhood in Arlington, there are marketplaces that you and I don't even know about, Lorne. There are markets for illicit goods and illicit drugs that I don't know about, and I'm assuming you don't know about, and the others, listening in right now don't know about. There are always marketplaces. There are layers and layers of markets, and some of which you're not aware of. But you can think of all of the aspects of your life as markets as well. So go with that idea first. The second is violence, coercion, corruption. These things occur when they're feasible. When it's feasible for violence, you'll see violence. The alternative to that is when there's injustice, when there's persecution, you don't always see violence. So this is again another example of how the narrative that you read about in the Washington Post tomorrow or see on the nightly news tonight is not the narrative I'm telling you. We tend to hear that I just told you the story of Osama bin Laden. It had nothing to do with religion. religion was a way in which the firm had a brand and an identity, and it used it for recruiting and training. But it was about this entrepreneur's career path and his path to be somebody, right? So I'm arguing here in this book that terrorism is not about religion, and insurgency and civil war is not about ethnic persecution, religious persecution, or poverty. And the idea is those ideas are very important to violence, but the world is full of injustice, Lauren, and violence occurs almost nowhere. So injustice can't be the cause of the violence. It can be an important part of the story, but violence occurs where violence is feasible. So if there's injustice, if there's poverty, if there's some sort of motivation for overthrowing the king or overthrowing, the feudal lord, or overthrowing somebody, if there's justification, you won't see the violence unless we can successfully enter the market and be successful or have some expectation of success. So the violence happens when it's feasible. North Korea today, there's massive injustice, there's massive corruption, but the ability of the North Korean people to overthrow the dictator isn't there. And so there's no violence in North Korea, even though there's massive injustice and poverty and corruption and all kinds of evil going on there, right? So the violence requires feasibility for violence. The underlying motivations can be many and myriad, and they often are. But the violence itself is a function of the market. So feasibility is the first point, but I'm bringing it back to what you asked about. In a market, can an entrepreneur enter the market with thugs and guns and weapons and rise up and dominate? Well, probably not in the United States, no, but probably in lots of other parts of the world, because the market in the United States, or let's just go back to Arlington, Virginia, the market in Arlington, Virginia for armed revolt is such that it's not feasible. But there are lots of places in the world where if you are adequately resourced, you actually could engage in an armed revolt. And that's where we see armed revolts.
That's a lot. So that's great. I mean, I love having, my brain kind of like, okay, I'm just kind of catching up with this.
Yeah.
So how are you recommending to governments and institutions to reduce the feasibility for violence?
Yeah. So the last chapter of the book, I have like three points on how to improve security. By the way, for people with video, that's the book cover.
It's I think I may have mentioned it earlier, but so people know, it's The Economics of Violence, and it's available on Amazon right now.
Great. So how to improve security. So I say there are 3 steps. The first is to analyze the market like a business executive. So if you're the Secretary of Defense, National Security Advisor, or the Chief of Police, or anybody around the world whose job is to deter or prevent violence, coercion, corruption, think about the landscape in market terms. So how would a business executive do business analysis on competitive or firms in a competitive marketplace? So that's step 1. So if you're thinking about how do we defeat the Taliban, how do we defeat the Islamic State, how do we defeat the Sinaloa cartel, think about them as firms operating in competitive markets. Second is you have to define victory in market terms. The example of that is, the United States killed Osama bin Laden, and then the Islamic State rose in its place, because it certainly, killing Osama bin Laden, an evil person, may have been a goal, but it didn't end the firm that was really out there to threaten the United States, the far enemy. And that became the Islamic State. So we have to define victory in market terms, and it might be to put the firm out of business. So getting rid of the CEO doesn't always get rid of the firm, right? Lorne, when the United States killed the leader of Iranian Al-Quds forces, I wrote an op-ed and you reposted that generously for me. It's the same idea as Al-Quds forces had a very dynamic and powerful CEO, and we killed him. And the question I raised at that time was, well, what does this do to Al-Quds forces? Because it's Al-Quds forces that are actually a threat to the United States and our friends and allies around the world. They're the arm of the Iranian government, the Iranian military that projects power overseas by engaging in acts of terrorism. We killed the head of the group. That might have been a good thing to do from a justice perspective, but did it make us safer? So we have to define victory in market terms is the second. And third is that we have to fight like an entrepreneur ourselves. So if you are the president of the United States or the head of an organization that is engaged in combating violence, coercion, and corruption, think about yourself as an entrepreneur in a competitive marketplace, combating another entrepreneur leading a firm in a competitive marketplace. So you have to fight like an entrepreneur. The counter to that is if you think just in kinetic terms, then you're like, okay, well, my enemy is that person over there. I'll go kill that person. That's not necessarily how you fight like an entrepreneur. An entrepreneur is going to try to think about the dynamics of the market. And if I kill that person over there, what happens to the market? What happens to the firm? One of the things I think we got wrong in Iraq and Afghanistan over the last 17 years is we killed lots of bad people and they were replaced by more bad people. It's like, well, did we think about the market dynamics of kinetic force? I don't think we did. I don't think we thought about it properly or well. And I think if we thought about firms and markets and entrepreneurs, we might have taken different steps and we might have achieved more success.
So the question I'd love to ask is about how would you frame, and you can, I mean, there's obviously a ton of things going on in the world that we can look at. If you were to pick one of them, how would you look at it from this frame as a way of, okay, we can beat this entrepreneur in this marketplace? But I guess in a way it's also like removing the marketplace. Like you said, in Arlington, there's not really a marketplace for revolt. And by the way, just for folks who are listening, Fortune magazine online, March 28th, which was yesterday, Gary wrote an article, Why the Coronavirus Won't Cause Widespread Chaos in the US, which is kind of based on this. That's right, Gary? I think. Anyway, so I'd love to hear your thoughts about, well, how could we walk me through what would be if you were king of the world?
So first of all, don't let anybody be king of the world. Step one. So when you look at a marketplace, it could be Arlington, Virginia, could be the United States of America, could be any place in the world. You want to, I think, ask yourself, what are the rules and associated enforcement of those rules, and who's setting the rules and who's enforcing the rules? If it's clearly defined, so this is in economics, this is the definition of an institution. An institution is comprised of the rules which constrain and enable human behavior and the associated enforcement of those rules. That's it. That's what an institution is. These institutions exist everywhere. They exist in Arlington. They exist in Maywood. They exist in Washington, D.C. Ask yourself who sets the rules and who enforces the rules. There is not violence in the United States because the rules regarding who gets a ventilator to address coronavirus and who doesn't, that's not up for grabs. We all know, whether we like it or not, whether we're pissed off or not, we know that control of ventilators is firmly in control of government decision makers. Could be state or county, or it could be the municipality, it could be the hospital itself. But there's a process that's knowable and enforceable over ventilators. So we have a scarcity, and that scarcity is bumping up against life and death, which is the formula for violence, which I said, if there's an opportunity for violence, it's where expected scarcity and expected survival meet. We're in the middle of that right now with coronavirus. It's not toilet paper. We're not going to see violence over toilet paper, because I think, A, that's an expected scarcity and not a real scarcity, and B, I don't think toilet paper and survival overlap, right? But masks and ventilators in a hospital, absolutely. If it were possible for an armed uprising to march into a hospital and kick everybody out, and for an armed gang to take over the hospital and determine who gets the ventilator and who doesn't, that's not in the United States. That's not where we live. That's not what's going to happen here. There might be places in the world, Lorne, where that is possible, though, and that's where it will happen. So think about the tragedy that could take place where there isn't a strong government that has monopoly control over the ability to set rules and enforce rules. Then you're going to have gangs rise up and enforce them. But let me give you a counterexample. I want to argue against what I just said. Sometimes the government is more corrupt than the gang. Sometimes the gang is incentivized, even though they're non-governmental, to do the right thing. There's a fascinating article in the newspaper last week about the gangs that operate the favelas in Brazil. They are selling drugs and requiring users to wash their hands, to use hand sanitizer, and they're enforcing social distancing, and they're enforcing a curfew. So if you think about it, this is a great example, coming back to where we started, Lorne. These are sane and rational business people. They are selling drugs, absolutely. Is it illegal? Absolutely. But it's good business to make sure your users are washing their hands and staying clean and staying safe, because if all of your users come down with coronavirus, your business is going to suffer.
So I think about the thing that occurs to me is what appears to me is irrationality in like Sudan, where they're saying, okay, well, I don't know if it's still happening, but that to get rid of a huge chunk of the population, I guess I'm trying to think of are there places where, actually I'm thinking of a lot of things. I'm thinking of when you look at like a marketplace, what are all the different dimensions of a marketplace?
So to simplify it, just go back to what I said. What's the scarcity? What's the scarcity?
But you're saying that there could be a scarcity there's perceived or real scarcity. If you talk about like someplace in sub-Saharan Africa,
yep,
where there is a scarcity of certain things, people may not care because they don't really need those things. Or
scarcity and survival, when they meet,
yeah,
that's the formula. When scarcity and survival, when expected scarcity and expected survival meet, is your opportunity for violence, and then you have to identify who sets and enforces the rules. That's it. It's really that simple.
Do you think that there's an opportunity, a chance? Is there a movement around this type of getting away from making our enemies othering, and instead looking at them from this perspective in a way to kind of resolve the problem? Because the end game, the goal that you're looking to have is to have less violence.
Right. Less violence and more freedom and more security, right? There's no violence in North Korea. That's not the goal, right? It's to have less violence with more security and freedom and all of these things that we think are important to advancing the human condition. So just to be careful, it's not no violence. There's lots of no violence in the world in very, very terrible places. The goal is to advance the human spirit in environments in which the human spirit can exercise freedom and safety and security. That's the goal. And yes, I think there is a lot of support for this, Lorne. This is first of all, this book is the culmination of years of my work. And again, as I'm somebody that's been in the national security field for over 2 decades, it's published by Cambridge University Press. It's peer reviewed, so it's the arguably the #1 academic press in the world for economics, peer reviewed. The advanced praise for the book comes from a dozen mainstream national security people, all welcoming this movement of behavioral science into the space of national security. It's a theme that I have been talking about for a number of years, and while I'm not in the majority, obviously, there is tremendous support, and I'm not the only voice in this field. The other way to think about this, Lorne, is the entrance of behavioral science into all kinds of other aspects of our lives. Behavioral science is being used by Google and Facebook and other companies, Amazon. So there's this widespread adoption of behavioral science, which has become possible and feasible because of big data. This world of big data and technology and machine learning, which is my day job at Giant Oak, is about using all of this data that we have today that we didn't have 5 years ago to build better and smarter models of human behavior. And so the illicit world, the commercial world, has figured this out and has adopted this. And now's the time for the national security world or the public safety and security world to get on board and say, look, if I can sell more sodas and more refrigerators by using behavioral science, why can't I combat human traffickers and drug traffickers using behavioral science? And the answer is you absolutely can do it.
Has this occurred? Has there been an example that you could point to in either government or commercial that's adopted your framework?
I can give an example of when I was in government. So when I was last in government, and this was a while ago, so this is pre big data. But again, I'm an economist who held senior government positions. But when I was last in government, there was there were lots of smugglers smuggling people into the United States, and they moved to a new part of Texas to smuggle people in. And they would fly them from South America into Mexico, and they would smuggle them in this new part of Texas that previously didn't see a lot of smuggling. And to be honest, the smugglers were overwhelming the US government system. So what we did was we devised a policy of focusing on this new sector. And it was zero sum. We didn't have unlimited funds or money, so we took resources from other sectors and moved them to this sector. Within 30 days, the smugglers shut down. They, like, this new innovation of going to the sector, shut down. And then we were able to redeploy our resources back to our other traditional sectors. The reason this worked is because the smugglers were business people who had to make money. They don't smuggle because they believe in smuggling humans. Drug traffickers don't sell drugs because they believe in the inherent goodness of cocaine or heroin. These folks do things because it's how they can best advance their career. It's how they can best generate an income for themselves and their families. That's why they do it. So when we cause them to fail as a firm, then the firm fails and it goes on and does something else. And that's what we did in this example is we thought about the smugglers as a firm and we put them out of business. So it wasn't about finding them and arresting them, because then somebody else would step up in the firm and get a promotion and they would be like happy. We put the firm itself out of business so that the smuggling went back to its traditional roots where we already had a lot of resources and strength aligned.
So I want to open it up again to, that's really awesome. To the folks who are listening, if you have a question, either raise your hand, pressing the raise hand button, or pop a comment in the chat box, and I'll pick on you. I'm gonna just kind of quickly, I think, unmute everybody just to see if anyone has a question. Anyone have a question? Oh, Carol? No, okay. All right, well, so, okay, so let's go back to, oh, unmute you. So theoretically, just theoretically, if you gave people who were convicted of crimes in the United States a different business model where they were able to meet their financial needs that had nothing to do with crime, theoretically, they wouldn't become criminals.
So remember what I said, where economics is not about money. You just went back to the.
Oh, sorry.
You just fell back into the trap.
My badness. So if because again, I'm just still trying to grok this. That if their needs for expression, for yeah, it's definitely a little difficult for me to wrap my head around. I'll be honest.
Yeah. So, but the answer, you just answered your own question. Obviously, you're not going to end all crime, because people aren't necessarily all optimizing the same thing. Some people want money. Some people want power. Some people want fame. Some, there are all kinds of motivations. And in fact, you might change your mind over time. You might not change your mind week to week, but maybe year to year. Maybe there are times in your life where you're just like, I wish I could make more money. And other times in your life, which is like, I just wish I could, have a bigger impact on social good. We change our optimizations over time. That's okay. That's very normal. That's very much part of the human condition. So
like changing jobs or changing careers.
Right. Absolutely. Right. How people are about that. Sometimes we change careers. In my own career, I've been in government, I've been a full-time academic, I've been in industry, and I wouldn't have it any other way. I love the ability to change every couple of years. It's great. You could say that I'm optimizing my ability to change. And that's the one constant in continuing to work on this issue of understanding the human behavior of violence, crime, and coercion. So yeah, you can't look for a panacea of like, if the government had a program where everybody got $1 million, we'd see the end of crime. You just know that's not true. If everybody got $1 million, there'd be the same amount of crime as there is today.
Right.
Because there'd be more stuff to steal. There's no simple answer to that. It's about who sets the rules and who enforces the rules. Is violence feasible or not? That's on the one side. So you need you need governance, you need rules and enforcement, and you need you need to empower the people. So people need to be empowered so that way whoever has the power to set and enforce rules doesn't have too much power. And so there needs to be a check on their power. And likewise, if there's nobody in the center to have and enforce rules, then the people can be too empowered and fractionalized. And then you have chaos, and then you have economic stagnation, and you have a growth of poverty, and you have a growth of violence. So it's this balance between the two, Lorne, where you want a strong rule setter and rule enforcer, but not too strong. And you want to make sure that the rule setter and rule enforcer is taking actions consistent with your view of right and wrong and good and bad.
Mm.
It's a lot, right?
It is a lot. I think it's great. I mean, it sounds promising and hopeful and filled with optimism about how we could better have an existence on the planet.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we fundamentally, there's goodness in this story. And I think a lot of goodness comes from just better understanding what might be scary and upsetting in the world. And I think if this book at least does that, then it's made a minor contribution that I will feel good about.
Awesome. So Gary, why don't you just hold up the book again so folks know? And how can they reach you if they want to reach you, if people want to get a hold of you?
On LinkedIn, you can follow me, reach me on LinkedIn, and I have a website, GaryShiffman.com, and the book is available on Amazon and your local bookseller.
Awesome. Thanks so much for being a guest, and thanks listeners for joining. We're going to post this on YouTube and on it'll play on the radio in a couple of weeks here on 96.7 FM in Arlington. And everyone be safe. Stay away from each other.
Thanks, Lorne. Great questions. Great conversation. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah. I'm going to be like processing this for the rest of the day. Thanks again.
Thank you.